So welcome to part three, and I want to consider a response to Williams. And I think this is one of the most influential one of the most influential responses to Williams. There are others out there. In fact, there's a small industry of people who like to respond to Williams and say that an eternal or mortal life would not be boring. But I think the most influential is due to John Martin Fisher, who we encountered already in the collaborative class about free will. So Williams's paper is quite dense and difficult in some ways. Williams's writing is often like that, quite rewarding if you give it enough reads. Fisher's paper is a response. I always remember it as being a little bit more straightforward than it is, but I think at that time, his response shared a little bit of the denseness of Williams's paper. But I think Fisher does do a pretty good job of breaking down what Williams's core argument is and then responding to it. So Fisher argues that Williams' argument is successful. So Fisher does well at identifying these two different parts of Williams's argument. And if we think of Williams as presenting a dilemma, Fisher argues that neither horn is a worry, and like one or two are not true. So we don't have to. There's no real dilemma here because we're not. Well, there's no worry about becoming a different person, and there's no worry about becoming eternally bored. So against the point that if we change categorical desires, we'll become a new person. Fisher argues that, look, we can get new categorical desires without becoming a new person, at least in a metaphysically relevant sense. So think about it like this. When you were a child earlier on, maybe you wanted to become an astronaut or something crazy like that, like a fighter pilot or like a submarine, not a submarine pilot or something, an actual submarine or something, outlandish. At certain points, we really wanted to do certain things that we've then changed our minds about. And at certain points also, we've completed projects and gotten new desires. So we've done that. And our way of understanding that is that we had a categorical desire at one time, and then at a later time, we stopped having that categorical desire. Now, Fisher's point here is, look, you didn't become a new person when you changed categorical desires. You're still the same person you are now. You remember being a child where, you wanted to become an astronaut or like a fish or something like that. And then you stopped having those categorical desires and you're still you. You've just changed. The basic point here is that people's characters change, people's categorical desires change, and our characters and desires change without us becoming new persons in a metaphysically deep sense. I say metaphysically deep sense because if you carry on to do philosophy next year in 2A, you'll talk about personal identity. And so you'll talk about these kinds of cases and different accounts of personal identity, whether you're a psychological being, whether your identity is just about your character or memories, or whether you're essentially a human animal or some substance like a soul. These are all things you'll talk about in that section. But something that's clear from that section is that if we're thinking of personal identity in some metaphysically deep way, we can change characters and remain the same person, the same being, the same entity. We move through that. That's just the thing that happens. You lose a desire, gain a desire, lose a belief, gain a belief, lose a value, gain a value. Sometimes we have bigger changes and smaller changes, but we don't just go out of existence because we go through these changes of character. That's just a normal part of life. So Williams's point about personal identity seems a bit strong. If we understand him as talking about metaphysical personal identity. So it does seem that we can avoid a meaningless life, a meaningless immortal life by gaining new categorical desires, because it's just not plausible that we become a new person just because we get new categorical desires. So we can avoid boredom by just getting new projects, doing new things and moving on like that. But Fisher's response is quite good here. So he doesn't just rest in his paper, he doesn't just rest his argument on the idea that we can remain the same person. He also argues that, look, suppose we can't change categorical desires. We just have the same set forever. Fisher also thinks that we don't necessarily need to get bored. Some people might get bored, but not all people would get bored given the same set of categorical desires, the same projects. And Fisher's point here rests on the idea that there are repeatable pleasures. This is a very important concept to understand and get to grips with. Fisher gives an initial count in one of the readings that I set but he also develops and makes more precise the notion of through later work. So it's worth reading up about it. But for the present purposes, I think I'll give an account with the basics that will give you a clear idea about what repeatable pleasures are. So repeatable pleasures are well named because they're just pleasures that we can repeat. The thought here is that, there are certain things that we enjoy that we can endlessly keep enjoying. But there's no amount of times that we can enjoy, a particular salad or a particular book or a particular film or a particular activity. Like maybe you just have a really favorite film and you can just watch it over and over and over again. Fisher's thought is that there are certain pleasures for people that are repeatable. And if we were to live an eternal life, we could just keep enjoying those things. So Fisher himself gives examples of like eating nice food, sex, reading, doing philosophy, and so on. There's certain things understood broadly, we can just keep doing them. I can read all the books in existence, not get bored. Not sure if that's true of me, but there's a person for whom that's true. I can eat loads of nice food, blah, 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 whatever activity you want. And also Fisher here also points out that, look, sometimes the way Williams talks about an eternal life is that we just do one thing. Like, we're always eating like pasta. Pasta, delicious pasta. Maybe eating pasta is a repeatable pleasure, but maybe it's also the case that we want to do it all the time. Maybe one day we'll have pasta for lunch, then rice, then pizza, then burgers, and tofu, and steak. I mean, there's lots of foods, right? So if you were living an eternal life, you wouldn't have to just do one thing. And so Fisher's very importantly saying that, look, not only are some desires, some pleasures repeatable, but also we don't just have to do one particular thing, one particular pleasure. We can vary things. We can have a varied life where we, eat some foods someday and we do a bit of philosophy, or we do a bit of music, or we do some dance, some football, and then we do other things and we vary things, because that's how we keep life enjoyable for ourselves now. So why would it be any different if we lived an eternal, immortal life? We'd just vary things up, switch things around. Maybe we'd spend 10 years on one project, 10 years on another, mix them up. There's a lot of things we can do. So we can stave off this worry about boredom by the fact that, we can think more accurately about what we'd be doing in an eternal life. We would be, like I said, some things for a few years, other things for another set of years, and so on. So there. Fisher takes that to show that, even if we can't change categorical desires, we can avoid boredom in an immortal life. And so an immortal life can be a meaningless life. If Fisher's right, then death doesn't undermine meaningfulness in life. And so death isn't necessary for a meaningful life. But one worry that I have, and Thaddeus Metz has a similar worry in his book, is that I don't know how confidently we can hold that there are repeatable pleasures. So if we're thinking about an eternal life, we have to think about one that goes on infinitely into the future. But our lives are not like that. They're mortal lives. They're finite. They end at some point. So while we can confidently say that within our lifetimes, and perhaps within extended lifetimes like 10,000 years, 200,000 years, 2 million years, 10 billion years, perhaps we can confidently assert that during that time frame, pleasures are repeatable. It's not clear that we can confidently infer that, an infinitely long life would have repeatable pleasures, because maybe if life is long enough, you will have done each thing so many times and in each possible variation and order that it would then become meaningless. I don't think it's quite clear that that's true. Neither can I confidently assert that your infinitely long immortal life would become boring because you wouldn't be able to repeat certain pleasures. But here Fisher's supposed to be responding to Williams's point. So Williams says it would be boring. Fisher here seems to have the burden of proof to say, look, I'm going to show you how you can have, pleasure and avoid boredom in an infinitely long life. But he's only really shown us that we can have pleasure in a very long life. What we need is a case that it's going to be, we can have these pleasures and avoid boredom, and so have meaningfulness and infinitely long life, but we haven't been given that. So it's not clear that that point of Fisher's response works, at least not in my view. Maybe you disagree. Fine if you disagree. I would love to hear your reasons. But for me, I don't think it works because of that part. But I do think Fisher's point about personal identity is a very plausible one. Now, I've got my own take on this that I wrote in a short paper in a book on an edited book on the afterlife. My paper is called Practical Identity. It could act as somewhat of an introduction to discussions of personal identity and different senses of personal identity. So I think Fisher's point might rest on different senses of personal identity. None of that's going to be so important in this course. I do make the point about repeatable pleasures and talk about Williams and categorical desires, link Williams with John Locke's view of personal identity. And I think it's a fairly readable piece, but I would say that. But if you're interested in that issue, I would go and check that out. Now, for the moment, that's the end of the lecture on death or immortality. I think this issue, though, is one that's really, really worth thinking about. There's plenty of other articles on this, and some I've put in the further reading, a future article of Fisher's that I think is a development of his view, particularly his point about repeatable pleasures. But the reason I want to dwell on this is I not only think it's important for you to learn about in its own right, because I think it's very interesting, these issues about death and immortality, I'm going to talk about again in the final lecture, because I think it is going to be an issue for the objectivist. So at the moment, the arguments do seem a little bit inconclusive. The idea that we die, the sort of Tolstoy-inspired point that death would make everything meaningless, that challenge seems inconclusive. The immortality challenge also seems inconclusive. But perhaps there's still remaining worries for Woolf and other objectivists here. That's something I'll return to in the final lecture. I want to emphasize again that I think you should really think about this topic. All right, I'm going to stop it there.